So we shift gears away from Descartes on to Aristotle. The text we're going to be looking at for the next 5 weeks is called the Nicomachean Ethics. It is on Canvas, so you can see it there. You will also see on Canvas that I have posted as a supplemental reading a text called The Physics, and I'm working on posting as a supplemental reading a text called De Anima, or On the Soul. Those are purely supplemental. They're there so the ethics makes more sense. Because Aristotle, when he works through the ethics, he very much is thinking in terms of biology. He's very much thinking about well-being in terms of human beings as biological organisms. And as such, he has in mind what he has claimed earlier in these two texts. So you don't have to read them. I'm going to lecture today mainly on background in these two texts, but it would be helpful if you do read it at some point. Like I said, don't have to. It may just be helpful for you. So as far as Aristotle goes, we're looking at 3rd century BC. There we go. Looking at the 3rd century BC. And Aristotle is unique in that most of the works that we have by Aristotle are lecture notes. They're not actually edited and published works. That's why they can be a little disjointed and a little awkward to read. But this work, The Ethics, is one of his few actual edited works. It was written for his son Nicomachus. And it's kind of a handbook, a coming-of-age handbook on how to fare well in 3rd century Greek society. So if you look at our unit title on Canvas, I said that we're discussing normative ethics and well-being. Both normative ethics and well-being fall under the larger umbrella of ethics. They just have different focuses. So the focus of well-being is the question, what does it mean to live well? That's our focal question when we think about well-being. What does it mean to live well? Our focal question in normative ethics is, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for right action? That is, a different way we can articulate this is what makes actions good or bad. And normative ethics is a field concerned with theory building. It's concerned with developing competing theories that try to answer the question, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for an action being good, and by contrast, for an action being bad? As far as Aristotle is concerned, this is his primary focus. He is almost exclusively focused on well-being, on answering this question, what does it mean to live well? The reason I threw normative ethics in there is because throughout the millennia, especially in the past 70 or so years, it has become increasingly popular in a normative theory called virtue ethics to appeal to Aristotle's text and to use Aristotle as kind of a justificatory grounding for claims made within virtue ethics. Now, this is not our focus. We're more focused on exegesis of the text. But Aristotle is not a virtue ethicist. In many ways, Aristotle has no articulated conception of what makes actions good or bad in a normative sense. Aristotle is purely focused on what does it mean to live well. That being said, one can most certainly take Aristotle's claims and Aristotle's text and develop a normative theory out of it. If you're interested in virtue ethics, some excellent places to start is with works by Philippa Foot, as well as Julia Annis, and I think her name's, what's her first name? I think it's Juliet Anscombe. And to a lesser degree, works by Martha Nussbaum. These four women are excellent scholars in virtue ethics, but especially the first three. And they take Aristotle and run with it to develop a normative theory on what makes actions good or bad. So if you're interested in virtue ethics, look up Foot, Annis, Anscombe, or Nussbaum. They're a great place to start. We're not doing that. We're just doing Aristotle. Okay, background. In order to understand the ethics, that is the Nicomachean ethics, I'll usually refer to it as just the ethics. In order to understand the Nicomachean ethics, one must first understand Aristotelian physics. Now, when I say physics here, I don't mean what you do in your physics courses. That's Newtonian mechanics and beyond. The word physis in Greek, so physis simply means nature. So the physics, Aristotle's physics, is simply a study of nature. And to that degree, Aristotle thinks that the most fundamental concept in nature is change. All natural things change. It is not a natural thing if it is not subject to change. And Aristotle has an interesting way that he views change. He thinks change is, one, it's caused by certain kinds of causes. We'll get into that a little bit later. But he thinks that change follows a schematic or a pattern, if you will. So organisms, we're going to focus on living organisms. They change from being in a state of potentiality to a state of actuality. If these words sound clunky, that's because they're attempts at translating Greek phrases. Now, within potentialities, there's two different ways we can conceive of this. So the first one is what Aristotle calls a first potentiality. A first potentiality is a power or capacity had in virtue of the kind of thing that an organism is. I'm going to work through all the different kinds of potentialities and actualities, and then we'll superimpose this upon an example. So if this makes no sense to you, don't worry, we'll in about 10 minutes. Power and capacity had in virtue of the kind of thing an organism is. The second kind of potentiality is what Aristotle calls a second potentiality. A second potentiality is a power or capacity held by an organism as a result of some change. So those are your two kinds of potentialities. There's certain kind of capacities we have purely in virtue of the kind of thing that we are, and there's certain kind of capacities that we have because we've undergone some kind of change. Moving on to actualities. There's what Aristotle calls a first actuality. And this is where things get a little interesting. A first actuality is the same as a second potentiality. The two states are identical. And then we have this last phase of a second actuality. A second actuality is the active use of a power or capacity. So this is a lot of words to articulate a relatively simple concept. Okay, so let's have an example here. Imagine our example is, I'm going to erase, what am I doing? Let's say, to use one of Aristotle's examples, let's say the example is that of a human being becoming what Aristotle calls musikos, which we have translated as musical. There's a little bit more to the Greek concept of musikos, but works for now. So our example here is of a human being becoming musical. So Aristotle thinks that every human, when they are born, has the capacity for musicality, or to be musical, as a first potentiality. Why? Because we as human beings are simply the kinds of creatures that can play music and can learn music. Okay? So a first potentiality is simply a power or capacity held in because of the kind of thing that the organism is. By contrast, my cat, when it was born, did not have, as a first potentiality, musikos. It did not have the potential to be musical. Why? Because cats are not the kinds of things that could be musical creatures. Okay? By contrast, when you were born, you did have a first potentiality for musicality. Why? Because you're a human being, and this is something that human beings can do. So note that being musical in the sense of a first potentiality has nothing to do with skills. It has nothing to do with any kind of education. It is a skill had purely in virtue of a thing's biology. Okay? And as a result, first potentialities are going to differ from organism to organism. It makes no sense to try to teach my cat the piano because it's not the kind of thing that could ever become musical. It makes perfect sense to teach my daughter the piano because she is the kind of thing that could become musical. The same thing, it makes no sense to try to teach my daughter how to fly because she's not the kind of thing that by nature could ever fly, but it makes perfect sense to teach a baby bird how to fly because it is the kind of thing that by nature can fly. Okay. Now, as we age, we undergo some kinds of changes. Aristotle breaks up change in this sense into two broad categories. You have change that is due to education, and then you have change that is due to nature. Okay? Aristotle does not view nature as some kind of being that is out there. This is not God. This is just natural development. Okay? So a second potentiality would be, in this case of becoming musical, would be teaching someone music. Okay? So when I teach my daughter how to play the piano, she will now have musicality as a second potentiality. So she will be musical because she has undergone a change due to education. Okay. So what it is to have a capacity as a second potentiality is to have undergone some kind of change and to now have the relevant skill as part of one's constitution, so to speak. So Aristotle views these phases here as what he calls a hexis, which we translate quite literally as a having. Aristotle in many ways views skill acquisition, whether it be skills via education or skills that are natural. He views skill acquisition as gaining and grasping new capacities or new powers, and that the organism in question now has these powers tacked onto it because it's undergone some kinds of changes. Now, the reason that a second potentiality is the same as a first actuality is because the organism has undergone a change from its raw natural state to a state of having some skill. The difference between a second potentiality and a first actuality is what is emphasized. Okay? By calling it a second potentiality, we emphasize the ability for the organism to later put the skill to action. So, simply when I teach my daughter the piano, that doesn't mean she's contemplating music all day. That doesn't mean she is actively playing the piano. All it means is that she has the ability to play the piano, and she has the ability to do musical things, but they're not being put into practice at that moment. But, so first actuality is still being musical because of a change. When we call it a first actuality, all we are doing is emphasizing the change aspect. But there will come a time when she goes to a piano recital that she has to actively do the skill. And this is a second actuality. In a second actuality, there is yet another change. There is a change from contemplation of the skill, or having the skill latent, to an execution of the skill. That is, doing the skill in real life. So, when she goes to her first piano recital or any subsequent piano recitals, she will have to draw upon the knowledge that she has via education, and she will have to do the skill, actually play the piano. So, Aristotle views skill acquisition as tacking on an ability to an organism because of what that organism can do via nature, and then having this ability in a resting state, but then being able to later call upon the ability to use it in the world. So another example would be becoming grammatical. Aristotle uses this example as well. He uses it, he says, becoming grammatos, becoming grammatical. We may just say being literate. So think about it. Every human baby, when they are born, in virtue of the kind of thing that they are, has the ability to become grammatical, to know the rules of grammar, how to read. By contrast, cats and dogs, when they are born, they do not have this ability. This is why we don't read, unless we're just really anthropomorphizing our pets. This is why we don't read to cats and dogs, but we read to babies, right? In some sense, it makes no sense to read to your cat and dog unless it's somehow therapeutic for you as the human being. But it makes perfect sense to read to one's infant. Why? Because we know this is going to help them somehow. So when we're born, we have the ability to be grammatical simply in virtue of the kind of thing that we are, but that doesn't mean that we know a lick of grammar. It doesn't mean we know how to make use of this skill. It's merely a latent capacity we have because of what we are. But then we go to school. Our teachers teach us the rules of grammar. They teach us how to read. Our parents reinforce these concepts. And there comes a certain point that we are grammatos, that we are grammatical things. We now know the rules of grammar. This is the state of a second potentiality or a first actuality. We have undergone a change due to education, an external change, and now we have this skill set. We can be grammatical. But that doesn't mean you're constantly thinking about or employing the rules of grammar, right? When you are at your sporting practice, you are not thinking about grammar. Maybe not. I don't know what goes on through your mind when you're at soccer practice or whatever. But you're probably not thinking about grammar. But when you are in your English comp courses or in your foreign language courses, you are thinking about grammar. And it is now when you are thinking about grammar and how to employ the rules of grammar that you can be said to be being grammatical as a second actuality. Why? Because you are undergoing yet another change and bringing this skill to actualization. Now, because these two states of second potentiality / first actuality are the same exact state, what we have in Aristotle's mind is two changes. We have a change from first potentiality to second potentiality, from second potentiality to second actuality. And these changes have distinct causes. This first change, so I'm going to draw our arrows here showing where the changes are indicated. This first change from first potentiality to second potentiality is as a result of nature or education. So think about becoming grammatical. This is something you have the potential to do because you're a human being. Not every human being is grammatical. Not every human being is literate. Why? Because the changes that are a result of education, if there is no one providing the education, if there's no external source of change, then the organism in question will never undergo that change. Okay? So if we never teach a child the rules of grammar, or if we never teach a child how to read, that child will just never have this skill. So think, for example, there are plenty of skills that human beings have that you yourself may not have. Here's a simple one. Human beings have the capacity to, be musical. Just keeps using Aristotle's examples. There are plenty of people who do not know how to play a musical instrument. They have the ability to do so. Why? Because they're human beings. But because they were never taught how to play a musical instrument, they have this capacity simply as a first potentiality. Now they can go ahead and learn how to play a musical instrument and then move along this conception of change. But until they do so, it's merely a first potentiality. Or think about being bilingual. As human beings, we all have the capacity to be bilingual. But unless someone teaches you a foreign language, you will only ever have this as a first potentiality. Okay. But when we go to the piano recital, or when we contemplate the rules of grammar in our English comp courses, we undergo another change. We undergo a change from simply having a skill in us that has been imbued into us, so to speak, by nature or via education, to actively using the skill at hand. And this change is an internal change. It is calling upon the knowledge that we have to bring it to fruition or to bring it to affect the external world. Okay? Now note, you can't go to this stage of second actuality if you are not in this stage of a first actuality or second potentiality. You can't skip stages. So in order to play the piano at a piano recital, someone first has to have taught you the piano. If you were never taught how to play the piano, you have nothing in your psyche, in your soul or mind, that you can ever draw upon to then play the piano. Okay? So this internal change, Aristotle thinks, is an internal change of what he calls the psyche. The psyche usually gets translated as soul, but Aristotle does not mean this in any kind of religious sense, and for that reason, it's better to think of it as the mind. It is that which makes us animate, makes us living organisms. It's the thing inside all living creatures, be they centipedes or human beings, that differentiates them from desks and rocks. It's the animating factor. Okay? So, we've given an example with changes due via to education. But Aristotle thinks that this same schema of change can be applied to changes that are natural, so to speak. So consider locomotion. Locomotion being the ability to change one's location in physical space on one's own. For human beings, this is walking. This is how human beings locomote. Every human being, when they are born, has the capacity for locomotion, has the ability to walk. But if I take a newborn infant and place it on the floor, I'm pretty confident it will still be in that same exact place 20 minutes later. It's not going to move. Why? Because it has the capacity for locomotion purely as a first potentiality. This is a capacity it has because it's a human, and humans walk. This is what's part of the feature set that is characteristic of human beings. Now, as the infant develops and as it grows, there will come a point where this infant will walk. Now, what this differentiates capacities that are held in virtue of education and capacities that are held because of nature is no one has to teach the infant how to walk. The infant will walk even if no one teaches it how to do so. Now, that may come later if no one is helping this infant along, but nevertheless, the change will still happen. Okay? So changes that are a result of nature, Aristotle thinks it makes no sense, or it makes no sense for parents to teach these skills because they're not taught by parents. They're not taught by other agents. It is nature itself that teaches the infant how to walk. Same thing goes for language. If Aristotle thinks that language is a natural capacity that human beings have. So it makes no sense. One doesn't have to teach a child language. The child will acquire language. And unfortunately, we've seen this be the case with certain Russian orphanages after the World Wars, where there were so many orphans that the nuns in the orphanages could not pay individual attention to the children, and as a result, they grew up illiterate, not knowing Russian. But the children in the orphanage created their own language to communicate with one another. Why? Because as human beings, this is just what human beings do. They talk, they communicate. So if a human being is left to its own devices, it will create a language. It will create a way to talk. Those Russian orphans had a language that had its own syntax and grammar and all the conventions of language. The reason we teach children language is so that they know the language that we use. So someone has to teach you English when you are a toddler. Someone has to teach you Spanish or Greek or whatever. But if they don't do that, you're still going to talk. You just probably won't talk the language that is commonly spoken. Okay. Assuming you're in isolation. So there's very little sense, Aristotle thinks, in teaching these natural capacities to children, because they're going to get there by nature. They may get there at different times, but assuming the child is functioning normally, they're going to get there. They're going to walk. Okay? But just because you have the capacity, so now you're 3 years old, you can walk, that doesn't mean you're always walking. Not every 3-year-old is constantly walking. I FaceTimed my daughter this morning. She was sitting in her high chair eating breakfast. She was not walking. She has the capacity to walk. It's a second potentiality / first actuality for her. But until she gets out of the high chair and starts running around, the skill stays here. When she gets out of the high chair and starts running around the house, now it's a second actuality. Because now she is actively using the skill that she has. And Aristotle views this change in the same exact way as becoming musical. When we go from second actuality / first actuality to second actuality, we undergo an internal change. There's a change within the psyche, or the mind of the organism, where now it turns the skill that it has into an actualization of said skill. So this is how Aristotle views all change. And the skills that are had over here as a second actuality, in some sense, are all grounded here in first potentialities. It makes no sense to ever expect my cat to be musical because it doesn't have musicality as a first potentiality. My cat will never be musical. Even if it is the most brilliant cat to have ever catted, it will never be musical. Why? Because cats are not musical creatures. The same way, my daughter will never have as a second actuality the locomotive expression of flight because human beings don't fly. Okay? It makes no sense to, and this becomes important when we get to the ethics. It makes no sense to evaluate my daughter on her inability to fly because that's not what human beings do. It makes no sense to evaluate my cat on his lack of musicality because that's not what cats do. But I can evaluate my cat on his, in his case, inability to jump on furniture. Why? Because that's what cats do. Cats can jump. My cat cannot jump up well, or at least he doesn't realize that he can. So I can evaluate my cat on those aspects. And we do this for human beings. We can evaluate human beings on their ability to do things that are characteristic of human beings. This is how, for example, pediatricians can determine whether or not a child is cognitively typical or cognitively atypical, whether or not they're physically delayed or physically on track. Why? Because as human beings, we all follow a very rough pattern. Start walking around 1, start babbling around 18 months, start talking around 2-ish. It's because of that pattern of changes that happen via nature that we're able to compare human beings to one another. So I can tell a 2-year-old that is not walking, that's cause for concern. Why? Because at 2, a child should be able to walk. If that child is not walking, well, now we start to ask why. Why isn't this child walking? Think about skills that are held via education. This is kind of what differentiates, in some sense, maybe interesting and accomplished people versus uninteresting and unaccomplished people. Is interesting and accomplished people, they just have more skills. They learned more things. They can do more things than people who don't. Okay, this doesn't affect their worth as a person, but the person who is multilingual and can play musical instruments and can, I don't know, kite surf or whatever, in some sense they're just more interesting than the person who can't do any of that. Why? Because they have acquired more skills that were available to all normally functioning human beings. So this is how Aristotle views change. The next thing we need to talk about, this is all precursor. Our next lecture will actually dive into books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's been posted, but this is giving you a chance to actually read it. The next thing we need to do as a precursor is how Aristotle views natural things. So within the cosmos, within the world or the universe, we have natural things. But just because something is natural doesn't mean it is then organic. So we have organic things, and we have inorganic things. And the way Aristotle conceives of this is whether or not the thing has a suke, or whether or not the thing does not have a suke. Once again, this word suke simply, it's usually translated as soul, but don't get hung up on this translation of soul. It's the mind. It's the thing that makes a living thing animate. Okay, so things like rocks, they don't have a suke. Okay, they're natural things, but they don't have sukai. Whereas centipedes, moths, cats, dogs, trees, human beings, we all have sukai. We have minds. But that doesn't mean we're all the same. Okay? The mind of living things, let's probably just articulate this as living, because I didn't want to distinguish between artifacts and natural things. Living, I'm just going to call it inanimate, as unsatisfying as that may be, is anima, is the Latin word for soul. So living things fall upon a ladder, and this comes to be called, in the medieval period, the scala natura, or the ladder of life. Aristotle thinks that living things have a hierarchy. At the bottom of our hierarchy is plants. Plants are the least complex living organism. They're alive. Plants have sukai. They have souls or minds. But it's the least elegant, if you will. Because what it is to be a plant is to have necessarily the capacity for growth, to have the capacity for decay, to have the capacity for self-nourishment. So all living things, in order for them to simply be a living thing, have to be able to grow, they've got to be able to die, and they have to be able to self-nourish. Plants do all this. They do it very differently than we do, but plants grow, die, and nourish themselves. A non-essential capacity, but commonly held capacity of living things, is also the capacity for reproduction. That is, the capacity to propitiate its species. The reason I say that reproduction is non-essential is because Aristotle recognizes there are certain species that by nature are sterile. So consider mules. A mule is the mix between a horse and a donkey. A mule by nature is sterile. There is no mule that will ever reproduce. Okay? Because what it is to be a mule is to be a sterile creature. But nevertheless, mules are still living organisms. If we move up the ladder of life, or the scala natura, we get to animals. And Aristotle thinks that the minimally sufficient condition, the thing that an animal has to do at bare minimum in order for it to be an animal and not a plant, is to have the capacity for touch. Now, when I mean touch, I mean the capacity, the sensory ability to receive information via skin-to-skin contact, or contact, kind of contiguous contact. So, for example, when I touch the whiteboard, I'm getting information about the surface texture, et cetera, about the whiteboard. Okay, that is touching. But the moss or the ivy that is growing along your house is not touching the wall. Okay, it is contiguous with the wall. That means there's no space between
the ivy and the wall, but it is not receiving information from the wall. Now, put all this in context. I'm not a botanist, okay? If the plant is genuinely receiving information and determining how it should grow based on it being contiguous with the wall, then Aristotle simply committed to saying that it's an animal. Okay. But assuming that the ivy that is growing along your house is just contiguous with and not receiving information from the wall, then this does not satisfy the ability for touch. But think, for example, something like a sea anemone. Sea anemones, they do touch. Even though they look like plants and they seem to be a very low form of life, they are gathering information from their tentacles, I don't know, whatever you call them, about the external world. Okay? And this is a capacity for touch. Now, animals vary hugely in their capacities. So on the low end of animals, you may have something like a sea anemone or a sea cucumber. They're animals because they can do this, they can touch. But animals have so many more capacities. They have the capacity for perception. Some have the capacity for locomotion. Aristotle even thinks that some have the capacity for memory. Some have the capacity for some very infantile forms of language or communication. Aristotle's fine with all this. But nevertheless, the great apes, as complex as they are, or dolphins, as complex as they are, or octopodes, as complex as they are in the same bracket as sea anemone and sea cucumbers. They're animals. One, maybe the sea anemone perhaps only has the capacity for touch, whereas the great apes and the others have all these other capacities, but they're all in the same category because they lack that which is minimally necessary for being a human. The two capacities that Aristotle thinks are minimally necessary and sufficient for being a human being is one, understanding, and we'll go over what these terms mean in due time, and rational self-governance. These are the two capacities Aristotle thinks that all human beings have. What it is to be a human being is to have the capacity for understanding and for rational self-governance. Very briefly, understanding is the ability to grasp what Aristotle calls first principles. So, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. I may get 2 markers, get another 2 markers, have you count the markers. I may draw lines in the dirt. Here's 2 lines, here's another 2 lines. How many lines are there? There's a bunch of different ways we can represent this and try to teach it. But there has to come that aha moment, that moment when you're like, oh yeah, 2 + 2 = 4. Now, when I get the 2 markers and combine that with the other 2 objects, and I have you count the objects, that doesn't prove that 2 + 2 = 4. These first principles that Aristotle talks about, they're not open to demonstration. But eventually you're like, oh yeah, I get it. That makes sense. That's the capacity for understanding. It's the aha moment. I can put 4 markers and break them into 2 groups in front of my cat all day long, and it will never have that aha moment. Why? Because my cat's over here. It's complex. It's more complex than sea anemone. It's less complex than a great ape, but it's still not here. Somewhere in the middle. But then we also have this other capacity, the capacity for rational self-governance. And this capacity is going to be crucial for the ethics. Because capacity for rational self-governance is the capacity to do things for reasons. So cats can't go on diets. Because what it is to go on a diet is to decide to eat less so that you can, lose weight. Right? I can put my cat on a diet, I can feed him less, but my cat cannot actively choose to go on a diet. Okay? Human beings have the ability to do things for reasons. We have the ability to choose what Aristotle would call virtue for specific reasons. And Aristotle thinks that these two capacities are what it is to be a human being. The thing to note about the Scala Natura is that we classify organisms, living organisms, based on their capacities, not based upon preconceived notions. So if there's borderline cases, like, I don't know, Venus flytraps, right? Someone may ask, well, is it a plant? Is it an animal? All we do is we look at the capacities. If the Venus flytrap has the ability for touch, well then by definition it's an animal. Now it may be a very low form of life as far as animals are concerned, but it's an animal. If we find out that great apes can do these two things, or octopodes can do these two things of understanding and rational self-governance, then congratulations, it's a human being. So we determine what the living organism is based on the capacity that it has. Okay, we don't go into it with a preconceived notion. This here serves as the foundation for contemporary comparative biology. Okay, so for example, Aristotle would do experiments where he would look at like octopodes and see how their breathing and their heart systems worked, and cardiac and pulmonary systems. And Aristotle recognized that even though it looks really different from ours, it's doing the same exact thing. So it's the same kind of system. We still do this today. We just have different language to articulate it. All right, we're going to pause there. Next time, we're going to start books 1 and 2 of the Ethics proper.